What if the one thing a country spent 50 years building its entire power around just quietly stopped working? And what if nobody outside a few oil executives even noticed until it was already too late to reverse? Before we get into this, hit that like button right now, not because I'm asking nicely, but because this story explains something most news channels completely miss. And if you don't like the video, the algorithm won't show it to anyone else who needs to see this. So tap it, then let's get into it. For 50 years, one narrow stretch of water gave Iran something no army, no missile, and no nuclear program could fully replace. Fear. Real, functioning, global fear. Every time Iran hinted it might close that water, oil prices jumped, shipping companies panicked, and world leaders picked up the phone. That water is called the Strait of Hormuz, and for half a century it was Iran's greatest weapon without Iran ever firing a shot. Here's the strange part. Iran never needed to actually close it. The threat alone did the job. That's how powerful this one narrow channel used to be. Let's look at why. Take a map and find the Persian Gulf. Squeezed between Iran on one side and Oman on the other, there's a passage barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point. For decades, close to a fifth of the entire world's oil supply passed through that gap every single day. Saudi oil, Kuwaiti oil, Emirati oil, Qatari gas. Almost all of it had to sail through this one narrow doorway to reach the rest of the planet. Iran sits right next to that doorway. And that single fact gave Tehran something money usually can't buy. Not the power to win wars, the power to make the entire world afraid of what might happen if it wanted to cause trouble. That's a different kind of power. Quieter, cheaper, and in some ways far more effective than tanks or fighter jets. None of this was built to conquer land. It was built to make the world nervous. And for a very long time, it worked beautifully. Every time tension rose between Iran and the West, traders in London, Tokyo, and New York asked the exact same question. What if this time Iran actually does it? That fear alone moved billions of dollars. Fear became Iran's real currency, and Iran collected it for 50 straight years. But here's something people forget about currencies. They can crash. And right now, in real time, Iran's most valuable strategic currency is losing its worth fast. Not because of a war, not because of a treaty, because of pipelines. Actual steel pipes, buried quietly under desert sand, built without press conferences or dramatic headlines, slowly stripping away the one advantage Iran spent half a century protecting. Let's actually look at what's been built, because once you see the scale of it, everything else about this story starts to make sense. At the center of this shift is a massive pipeline system that runs straight across Saudi Arabia, from the oil fields near the Persian Gulf all the way to brand new export terminals on the Red Sea coast. This pipeline isn't new. A smaller version has existed since the 1980s, built as an emergency backup during the brutal Iran-Iraq War, just in case Hormuz ever became too dangerous. For decades, though, it stayed exactly that, a backup. Small, underused, mostly forgotten. That changed quietly around 2021. Saudi engineers began expanding pumping stations. They widened key sections of pipeline. They built enormous new loading terminals at a port called Yanbu on the Red Sea. What used to be a modest emergency route capable of moving a few million barrels a day has been transformed into a massive artery capable of carrying well over 10 million barrels daily. Some estimates say even more. Think about what that actually means. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, no longer needs the Strait of Hormuz to stay open in order to keep selling its oil. Crude can now travel entirely overland, skip Iranian waters completely, and reach tankers waiting safely on the Red Sea side, ready to sail toward Europe and Asia. But Saudi Arabia wasn't working alone. The United Arab Emirates built its own escape route years earlier, running from inland oil fields to the port of Fujairah, positioned outside the strait entirely. That pipeline became operational back in 2012, but for years it ran far below its full capacity. Nobody wanted to invest heavily in a backup plan when the main route was working just fine. That thinking has completely flipped. As tensions with Iran escalated and threats became louder, that pipeline stopped being an afterthought and started being pushed. Read that again, because it changes everything. The alternative routes can now carry more oil than the strait itself ever moved. That one fact quietly rewrites the entire balance of power across. Then Kuwait joined in. A newer pipeline connection now links Kuwaiti oil fields into the Saudi network, letting Kuwaiti crude travel overland and reach those same Red Sea terminals instead of relying only on tankers threading through Hormuz. This required real cooperation between three separate governments. Shared agreements, shared security planning, shared infrastructure, the kind of coordination between Gulf nations that honestly hasn't existed at this scale before. Now picture the terminals themselves, because the engineering here is genuinely impressive. The expanded facility at Yanbu can now hold more than 60 million barrels of crude oil. That's an enormous safety cushion. Even if pipeline flow slows down for maintenance, tankers keep loading without interruption because there's a massive reserve ready and waiting. On the other coast, the terminals at Fujairah now have deep water channels, wide enough for the largest oil tankers on Earth, along with offshore loading systems that keep working even in weather that would shut down an ordinary port. Put it all together, and here's the blunt truth. Saudi Arabia can now send oil west through the Red Sea. The UAE can send oil east through the Gulf of Oman. Kuwait can route its oil straight through the Saudi system. And when you add up the total capacity of these bypass routes, it now exceeds the total volume of oil that used to pass through the Strait of Hormuz on an average day. Read that again, because it changes everything. The alternative routes can now carry more oil than the strait itself ever moved. That one fact quietly rewrites the entire balance of power across the Persian Gulf. If you're starting to understand why Iran's military leadership is losing sleep over this, imagine how it actually feels sitting in Tehran, watching this unfold in real time, powerless to stop it. Quick pause here. If this kind of story is the reason you watch videos like this one, drop a single word in the comments describing how you think Iran's military leaders feel right now. I genuinely read these, and it helps me pick what we cover next. Now let's keep going, because the timing of all this is where the story gets even more interesting. None of this was rushed. Every phase of this pipeline expansion happened before the current wave of conflict between Iran and its rivals fully escalated. The Saudi expansion started back in 2021. The UAE pipeline reached full strength around 2022. The Kuwaiti connection came online in 2023. This wasn't a panicked reaction to a sudden crisis. This was slow, patient planning, built years ahead of time, almost as if someone knew exactly what was coming and wanted the exit already built and tested long before it was ever needed. When each project was first announced, officials described it in the most boring language possible. Export diversification, reduced port congestion, operational flexibility, nothing about strategy or warfare. And that's exactly the point. If you wanted to quietly take away your rival's biggest source of leverage without starting an open confrontation, this is precisely how you do it. Slowly, quietly. While the rest of the world stayed focused on louder, flashier headlines somewhere else. By the time Iran started ramping up its threats against shipping in the strait, the bypass network wasn't some plan sitting on paper. It was already built, already tested, already fully capable of absorbing the shock the moment it was needed. And here's where the results become visible, because we can actually track this happening through shipping data. Tanker traffic through. That entire foundation is quietly cracked beneath it. Iran can still technically sink a tanker in Hormuz tomorrow if it percent compared to normal levels. That drop isn't because Iran successfully blocked anything. It's because shipping companies are simply choosing not to send tankers through a danger zone when a safer path now exists. Vessels that once loaded oil in the Gulf and squeezed through Hormuz are now loading directly at Yanbu or Fujairah, sailing to their destination without ever entering range of an Iranian threat. Insurance markets tell the exact same story, and insurance rarely lies because money doesn't lie. War risk premiums, the extra cost charged for sailing through dangerous waters, have spiked again and again during recent Iranian threats for ships still using Hormuz. Every closure warning, every drone incident near a tanker pushes those premiums higher. Meanwhile, insurance costs for ships loading at the bypass terminals have stayed remarkably steady. The market has already made up its mind. Hormuz means risk, the bypass means safety, and money always follows safety. This creates something painful for Iran, a cycle that feeds on itself. The more aggressively Iran threatens the strait to try to reclaim its old leverage, the more shipping companies abandon it for good and shift permanently to the bypass routes. Every missile test, every naval standoff, every dramatic statement on state television pushes another handful of companies to make that switch permanent instead of temporary. Iran's own aggression is speeding up the exact outcome it's desperately trying to avoid. Now think about oil prices, because this part genuinely surprised traders around the world. For decades, any hint of tension near Hormuz sent oil prices climbing almost instantly, driven purely by fear of a supply shock. But watch what happened the last time Iran publicly threatened the strait. Prices did spike briefly, just like clockwork, just like they always had. Except this time, within days, prices quietly slid right back down. Why? Because traders realized something that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. The oil kept flowing anyway. Refineries kept receiving shipments on schedule. Tankers kept loading just from different ports. The disruption everyone feared simply never showed up in the actual supply numbers. And once markets learn that a threat doesn't lead to a real consequence, they stop reacting to it with the same fear. Every failed closure attempt chips away a little more at the psychological power Iran once held over global energy markets. That psychological power was arguably worth more to Iran than any weapon in its arsenal. And it's disappearing right in front of us. Let's sit with what this actually means for Iran, because the implications reach far beyond oil tankers and pipelines. For 50 years, Iran poured enormous resources into a military built around one core belief: control the access point to Hormuz, and you control leverage over the entire world. Billions went into coastal missile systems. Billions more into naval mine stockpiles, into fast attack boat squadrons trained specifically to swarm tankers, into radar networks stretched along the coastline. All of it aimed at one single mission. Threaten the strait, and the world listens. That entire foundation has quietly cracked beneath it. Iran can still technically sink a tanker in Hormuz tomorrow if it chooses to. It can still lay mines. It can still fire on passing ships. Nobody is saying Iran has lost the physical ability to cause damage in that waterway. But here's the brutal truth sitting underneath all of it. Even if Iran successfully disrupts shipping inside Hormuz, the global oil supply barely notices anymore because most Gulf oil no longer needs to pass through that channel at all. Imagine spending 50 years building the world's most feared lock, only to discover that everyone quietly built a new door on the other side of the house. That's essentially what happened here. The weapon still exists. The target it was built to threaten simply stopped mattering as much. So why can't Iran just build a countermove? Surely a country with Iran's military capability can adapt, right? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Geography doesn't negotiate. Iran's entire advantage around Hormuz existed because of proximity. Its coastline sits right next to the strait, giving its missiles, boats, and mine-laying vessels a short, fast reach into the shipping lanes. That proximity simply doesn't exist near the new bypass terminals. Yanbu sits on the Red Sea, hundreds of miles from Iranian territory, protected by distance itself. Fujairah sits on the open waters of the Gulf of Oman, far outside the narrow space where Iran's coastal weapons were built to operate. Iran can't just relocate its missile batteries to threaten these terminals, because the distances involved make that kind of coastal strike physically impossible with the systems Iran currently has. Could Iran use proxy forces to threaten shipping somewhere else, like the Strait near Yemen? In theory, yes, and there have been attempts at exactly this kind of pressure. But that's a completely different battlefield, with different naval defenses and different escalation risks. It's not a simple replacement for the leverage Iran is losing. And those proxy capabilities have themselves been weakened by sustained pressure over the ongoing regional conflict. What about sabotaging the pipelines directly? This gets brought up constantly, so let's address it honestly. Yes, in theory, someone could try to damage a buried pipeline running across Saudi territory. But compare that to sinking a moving tanker at sea. Pipelines are fixed targets. They're buried underground. They're watched continuously with sensors and patrols. Attacking fixed infrastructure deep inside another country is a completely different level of military and political risk than intercepting a ship in open water. And even if a section of pipeline was damaged, engineers can usually repair it within days or weeks. That's a temporary headache, not a lasting solution to Iran's much bigger problem. The investment behind this bypass network is simply too large, too valuable, and too important to the countries involved for them to abandon it over a single incident. They will rebuild, reinforce, and keep going because walking away means going right back to the exact vulnerability they spent years and billions eliminating. So realistically, Iran is boxed in. There's no countermove sitting on the shelf that restores the leverage it's losing. The tools that made Iran powerful for 50 years are still there, fully funded, fully trained, fully operational. They're just pointed at a target that stopped being decisive. I want to pause here for a second. If you're finding this useful, do me a favor and share this video with just one person who'd find it interesting too. Not because sharing is some magic algorithm trick, but because stories like this rarely get explained clearly anywhere. Else, and one honest recommendation from a real person means more than 100 random views. All right, let's keep going. Zoom out even further, and this becomes bigger than one region or one country's frustration. For decades, Western strategy toward Iran cycled through the same limited set of tools. Sanctions, which squeeze the economy but take years to show results and often get worked around. Negotiations, which move painfully slowly and frequently collapse under political pressure. Or direct military confrontation, which risks dragging the whole region into a war nobody actually wants. The pipeline strategy represents something different, a quieter fourth option that almost nobody talks about. Instead of trying to defeat Iran's leverage head-on, you simply make that leverage irrelevant by building around it. You don't need to convince Iran to give up its coastal missile systems. You don't need to sink its navy. You don't even need a diplomatic breakthrough. You just need alternative infrastructure strong enough that the original threat no longer produces the original consequence. It's a remarkably patient kind of strategy. It requires years of quiet construction instead of dramatic headlines. It requires multiple governments willing to share the cost and coordinate the planning. And it requires accepting that the payoff won't appear right away, but will build slowly until one day the threat that used to terrify markets simply stops working. That day appears to have already arrived. Here's what makes this genuinely remarkable from a historical point of view. Choke points have shaped global power for centuries. The Strait of Malacca, the the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. Whoever controlled access to these narrow passages held outsized influence over global trade, and by extension, global politics. Nations have gone to war over exactly this kind of control throughout history. What just happened with Hormuz might represent something genuinely new in how modern powers handle this kind of leverage. Instead of fighting to control the choke point itself, the more efficient move turned out to be engineering a way around it entirely. Build enough alternative infrastructure, and the choke point stops being a choke point. It just becomes one route among several, no longer capable of holding the entire global market hostage. If this approach keeps proving successful, it could quietly reshape how future conflicts over strategic waterways get handled everywhere. Instead of massive naval buildups to protect or contest a narrow passage, more nations might start investing in exactly this kind of redundant infrastructure as long-term insurance against future pressure. It's a lesson written in pipeline steel rather than gunmetal. But the message underneath it all is unmistakable. Choke points only hold power when there's no alternative. Build the alternative, and the power quietly disappears with it. There's a human side to this story too, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Picture the position Iranian military planners find themselves in right now. For years, their entire professional careers were built around one specific mission: protect and project Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz. Officers trained specifically for this. Budgets were allocated year after year to strengthen these exact coastal capabilities. Entire units within Iran's naval forces were structured around swarming tactics designed to overwhelm tankers inside that narrow channel. Now imagine being told that the mission your entire career was built around no longer produces the outcome it once did. That's not just a strategic setback. That's closer to an identity crisis for an entire branch of the military. And when institutions face that kind of pressure, the natural response is often escalation, not retreat. That may explain the increasingly aggressive rhetoric and more frequent provocations we've seen recently. It isn't necessarily confidence. In many cases, escalation like this is actually a sign of desperation, a scramble to prove relevance before the ground fully shifts beneath their feet. And here's the tragic irony sitting right at the center of all this. Every escalation Iran makes to try to reassert control over the strait only speeds up the exact outcome it fears most. More shipping companies abandon Hormuz for good. More insurance markets treat the bypass routes as the new normal. More buyers around the world grow comfortable with the idea that Gulf oil no longer needs that narrow passage at all. Iran is, in a very real sense, pushing the world further away with the very same actions it hoped would pull the world's attention back toward its leverage. There's a lesson buried in here that goes far beyond the Middle East. Leverage that depends entirely on scarcity or fear is inherently fragile because it only survives as long as no alternative exists. The moment someone builds an alternative, that leverage doesn't slowly fade away. It can collapse remarkably fast, sometimes within just a few years, exactly as we've seen happen here. Countries, companies, and even individuals who build their entire strategy around controlling access to something scarce should pay close attention to this story because it's a powerful reminder that scarcity is never permanent. Someone, somewhere, given enough time and enough motivation, will eventually engineer their way around it. So what happens next? The bypass network that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait built together isn't going anywhere. Regardless of how the current tensions eventually settle, infrastructure at this scale doesn't get dismantled just because a ceasefire is signed. These pipelines and terminals represent permanent investment. And once oil companies and shipping firms adjust their operations around a safer route, they rarely go back to the riskier option voluntarily. Even in a future where relations with Iran genuinely improve, these bypass routes offer benefits that have nothing to do with Iran specifically. Less congestion, more flexibility, insurance against any future instability in the region, from any source, not just Iran. This means the shift happening right now isn't a temporary wartime workaround. It's a structural change in how Gulf oil reaches the rest of the world, likely for decades to come. The Strait of Hormuz will still exist, obviously, and it will still carry oil, especially for producers like Iraq or Iran itself that don't have equivalent bypass infrastructure of their own, but it will no longer function as the single dominant artery it once was, and it will almost certainly never again hold the kind of unquestioned global leverage that once let a single Iranian threat move oil markets within minutes. For the countries that built this network, the reward goes far beyond simply neutralizing Iran's leverage. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have positioned themselves as significantly more resilient energy exporters, capable of keeping supply steady even during serious regional instability. That resilience turns directly into stronger relationships with the countries buying their oil, more predictable revenue, and frankly, more geopolitical weight on the world stage. When you can promise uninterrupted supply, no matter what happens regionally, the promise itself becomes worth billions over time. For the United States, the strategic value is just as significant, though quieter. Rather than committing to another long, costly military effort to protect access through Hormuz, American strategy shifted toward supporting infrastructure that solves the underlying problem more permanently. It reduces the pressure to maintain a massive, continuous naval presence dedicated purely to keeping one narrow waterway open. In many ways, it's a more sustainable, long-term approach to regional stability than repeated cycles of military escalation followed by uneasy calm that never actually fixes the root vulnerability. Before we finish, I want to leave you with something worth thinking about, because this story is bigger than oil, bigger than pipelines, and honestly, bigger than the Middle East itself. Every powerful nation, every dominant company, every person who ever believed their advantage was permanent, eventually learns the same difficult lesson: power built. Entirely around controlling one narrow pathway that everyone else depends on is never as safe as it feels in the moment. It feels unshakable, right up until someone patiently builds another road around it. And when that happens, the fall from power rarely comes with a dramatic explosion or a single decisive battle. It comes quietly, the way this one did. A pipeline expansion here, a new terminal there. Years of construction nobody paid much attention to, until suddenly the world wakes up and realizes the old rules simply don't apply anymore. Iran spent 50 years building fear around 21 miles of water. It took the rest of the world roughly a decade of patient engineering to make that fear obsolete. Not through one dramatic victory, but through steel, sand, and the quiet stubbornness of people who refuse to accept that geography alone should decide the fate of the global economy. The tankers are still sailing. The oil is still flowing. It's simply moving through doors Iran can no longer see, let alone close. And somewhere in Tehran right now, military planners are staring at maps that no longer mean what they used to mean, watching the one card they always believed they could play whenever they needed it, quietly and permanently taken off the table. If this video changed how you see global power and showed you how much of it actually happens quietly, through patience and infrastructure rather than explosions and speeches, then subscribe to this channel now. This is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week, and you won't want to miss the next one.